cheddar cheese in caves, but also other kinds of cheese, of course, could be stored in Quebec. The monasteries with their deep castles and deep walls and cellars and so on were an excellent place for storing cheese. Monasteries, dungeons, castles, these are places where different varieties of cheeses became popular. There was an interesting experiment some years ago along the Saguenay River, and somebody discovered that deep down in the Saguenay Valley, in the water, in this beautiful area, the water temperature is always around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It was just the right temperature anyway for storing cheddar cheese long term. And so, without asking the ministries and so on, especially the Ministry of Environment in Quebec, whether this was legit, he had special containers made for several thousand pounds of cheddar cheese that he bought, and put them in these containers and dropped them into the Saguenay Gorge. And he was going to come back a year or so later, bring them up, and he'd had well-aged cheddar cheese. And two problems. One, the environmental people were quite upset about him dropping these things into the pristine waters of the Saguenay, and so he was fined quite a sizable amount for that. And then he went to retrieve the containers with the cheddar cheese in it, and they'd all been washed away by the current in the river. So it was an experiment gone a little awry in terms of cheddar cheese anyway. Any cheese, and particularly making good cheddar cheese. And one is the matter of the right kind of vegetation. And the natural grasses and the domesticated grasses that grow around here and in Vermont and in Somerset, England, just happen to be right to produce the quality of the milk essential for making cheddar cheese. Of cow's milk, that is, of course. And the grasses, of course, are dependent on the soils. We have very rich, mineral-rich soils that are left from the Ice Age in this area that have been quite forgiving. The right amount of rain, the right amount of sunlight. And so it's the same as making wines. The grapes that grow in any particular valley around Paris, for instance, is very, very dependent on the quality of the soil and the environment that's there. So you get the various types of wines growing in different valleys. And you can't duplicate them. You can't duplicate the grapes from one valley to the next. You can't duplicate the wines from one valley to the next. And the same to a considerable degree is true of cheddar cheese. And for those that might have an interest in Scotch whiskey, single malt Scotch whiskey up through the valleys of Scotland, up into the Highlands, each distillery in each valley is depending on a slightly different variant of rye or whatever grain they're using for the malt. And so connoisseurs of fine whiskey will go from one distillery to the next, and one will be good, and one will be terrible, and so it varies from valley to valley. And it depends very much on the taste of the connoisseur, which is good and which is not so good. I can't claim to be an expert in that area, but you can get the point that the environment has an enormous impact on the quality of the milk in this case, and that affects the quality of the cheese. And this area around here, one of the reasons why Hershey came to Smith Falls originally was because of the quality of the milk, the climate, the vegetation, the type of environment produced just the quality of milk that they wanted for making fine milk chocolate. Cow Gate, some of us might remember that name. I'm sure Marion does. In Gananoque, for a while it was the world's biggest producer of manufactured milk products, especially during the Second World War. The British, anticipating the Second World War is coming on, they sent a lot of their industry to Canada, such as Cow Gate to Gananoque and Alcan to Kingston to make the movement. So the reason why Cow Gate came to Gananoque was again because of the quality of the milk that was produced here. So then the next step, of course, are the cows, in this case, that pastured on those grasses. And Bruce will tell you adamantly that the very best breed of cattle for producing milk is Jerseys, right? That's right. Now, maybe occasionally when you took the milk to the weighing-in stand, did you go to the Elgin factory? Younger or?
No, we never sent milk to cheese factory.
Oh, okay.
No.
So, at the weighing-in stand, you had farmers arguing, which was the best, the Holsteins, of course, and the visitors down the road here might argue that the very best cattle for producing dairy milk would be Ayrshires, right.
But you raise your cattle as well for a higher fat content.
Right.
And the clever farmers, of course, choosing the partners.
Right.
The cattle then would increase in their milk production and higher fat content.
Yeah,
It's almost like maple trees. There are certain maple trees that have a much higher sugar content.
exactly.
So the same with Holsteins.
Yeah, that's right. And so a great deal of effort has gone into breeding them to get the right quality. Good point. So the cow, Stevens and his followers from Vermont to Plum Hollow and Delta, and at that time there was a cottage industry, exactly the same as the cheese that we have here. It was made in the home. And in fact, in, what was the year? 1851, Horace Sheldon, and some of us would probably be familiar with that family name. It's been around for many, many years. Horace Sheldon homestead on the shore of the Big Rideau Lake. He boasted 3 oxen, 10 milch cows, not milk cows, milch cows. That was the way it was recorded in the census of 1851. 12 calves. There must have been a couple of twins there. 7 horses, 30 sheep, 20 pigs. And so, remember this is 1851. We think of this being sort of wilderness at that point, but already quite established farms. And numerous fowl. It included orchards, gardens, produced maple sugar, cider, butter, cheese, and woolen cloth. And the DeLong farm, just over this way, about the same time, in 1 year it produced 2,500 pounds of cheese. So it was very active production.
You've got one of her
even back in
presses.
the,
We've got her press.
that's right, the DeLong farm was
Yeah.
right. If a pioneer family had any cheese and butter surplus up to their immediate needs and their annual needs, because keep in mind they're making the cheese and butter and things like this during the summertime, and they'd store it in their basement or wherever on into the next winter. So that was to get them through the winter. And if they had any surplus to what they produced, then that's what they could sell on the market. And so it was a commodity that was storable, transportable, and marketable in a barter economy.
Well, didn't the DeLongs have quite a class for butter? Weren't they?
Yeah, the farm,
They were first
farm
class
I'm
for
on.
butter
they made butter and sold it.
Right.
and sold it.
And they would make that butter late in the fall after the cows got up. They'd be one cow losing get bread or something.
Right.
And they put it down and sell it on earthen crocks.
Right.
Of course, by spring it tastes more like cheese than it did butter.
But they won a lot of awards.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah. No, there certainly were a lot of awards won, not just by families, but also by the cheesemakers around here. Yeah, it was an interesting story. The production of an awful lot of whiskey. And so I think in Delta in 1 year there was something like 25,000.
15,000 gallons, all drunk locally. And remember, there were only 8 or 12 little log cabins in Delta. That's why the first temperance sermon in Canada.
To producing cheddar cheese. And so the cheddar cheese moved from being a cottage industry where people made the cheese in their own kitchen, back summer kitchen or outside, to being produced in factories. And a couple of the early factories around here were quite small by even any today's standard. One was on the Myers farm, just along Highway 15, and the well is still there. You can find the well for it, because you needed a good supply of cool water in making cheese. And there was a 1 vat operation that used the milk from a couple, 3 of the surrounding farms. Another one was back on the Pool farm. And again, it was a small one. Many of these factories only lasted a few years. If you've ever been to Upper Canada Village, you might have seen how they made cheese in these early factories. It was basically quite similar to making maple syrup. They had a vat, rectangular vat, over top of a fire. And it became a rather dangerous situation because over months and years, butterfat spewed out and got into the woodwork around the building. And so having a fire in close proximity to several years accumulated butterfat, and you had an interesting situation. So understandably, very few of these factories still stand.
And the Ford and the factories are all plank.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
So, you know, it all took was a spark.
that's right. And also, of course, having a fire underneath a vat of milk, it was rather difficult to control the temperature. You know, scorch it, there was all sorts of problems. So, virtually, I don't think any of these factories still stand. The place to see that type of technology is to go to Upper Canada Village. And the new factories that were built up over time had, where they were bigger, they could have maybe 2 vats instead of 1. And they had vats that were double framed, or doubled, so that they could use the steam from a boiler to go around the vat and heat the milk up to the correct temperature for making cheese. That implied having a boiler. And
Boilers blow up.
yeah, boilers blow up. And so that was a common occurrence in those early years too. The boilers had a nasty habit of blowing up. And so this is where one of the many ways that government inspection came in, because of the disasters. When a boiler blows up, it tends to take everything up, just like a giant mushroom cloud. And so obviously not too many people survived a boiler explosion. If you didn't sort of go a mile in the sky with it, you were scorched unbelievably. So it was not a happy situation. So inspection of boilers became important. Also the inspection of the quality of the milk, all the way right from the cheese itself, right back through to the farm that produced it. So cheese production moved from a subsistence cottage store to commercial factory industry. And specialized breeds of cattle were introduced. In fact, breeds were brought over from northern Germany, Denmark, that was the Holstein Friesian area. The Jersey breed came from
Jersey Island.
the Jersey Islands, that's right, Jersey Islands. And so these breeds were introduced. Greater emphasis on selective cattle breeding to improve the quality and the quantity of the milk. Cattle were no longer destined to, at the end of the summer, to go into a barrel of salt, because cattle basically had been for meat, salt beef, corned beef prior to that. But the emphasis on dairying meant a very different philosophy, because instead of killing the beef at the end of the summer, as I say, to go into barrels of salt beef, it became necessary to keep the cattle and to look after them and nurture them through the winter, and to select the best calves that will produce the most milk over 8 or 10 or 12 years, maybe a decade or more. Heifers are valued for the decade or more through which they may produce milk, rich in casein and butterfat. Milch cows had to be carefully nurtured and fed effectively over the long winter with nutritious fodder and grains, and hence they might bear healthy calves in the spring and provide abundant milk during the next summer. This was a different economic imperative, very different agro-technological change, a major change in the thinking and foresight, indeed, of the whole sociology of farming. Marketable in this corner of Upper Canada. And the earliest cheese factories often served the immediate local area. Milch cows were milked by hand in those years before rural electrification, although there were some ingenious experiments with pedal-powered milking machines, for instance, or a combination of a bicycle and a milking machine. There are even dog-powered milking machines, so the dog went around on a wheel and ran the milking machine. But much of the milking, of course, was done by hand. Average dairy herds might consist of only a few cows, maybe up to 20. Dairy farmers, the men and the women, the young and the old, were easily identifiable at political conventions and at the doorway of the churches, because they had the very firm handshake. Milk cans were set in cold water to cool and keep the milk fresh overnight. And the cows were then milked again early each morning. 2 milkings were taken to the cheese factory aboard a light wagon. And a successful herd at the peak of the summer, production might fill 3 or 4 cans per day. Legend has it that one farmer had his horse actually trained to take the buckboard of the wagon, the milk wagon, to the factory, and so that he could catch up on his sleep while the horse went to the factory. And some of the local lads recognized this, that this particular chap was always nodding off as the wagon was going by, so they hopped on the back. And this was after they caught several frogs, and they lifted up the tops of the cans and put frogs in them. So, you know, sort of like that legend about the frog that got into the milk can and swam around all night, so by the morning it was actually sitting on a wad of butter. I think maybe they were trying to see whether that actually happened, but I don't know whether it did. So in those early days, the factories had to be in quite close proximity, and relatively small ones, with a distance of maybe a mile or so between each factory. With the coming of small trucks in the early 1900s, or some farmers took the back off a Model T car and converted it into a truck, and so the factories could become bigger and a little bit farther apart as the old factories burned down, or one thing or another happened to them. After World War II, larger trucks operated and owned and operated by contractors took the milk from the farm to very large, more distant factories. And the distribution of the small local factories also changed, as many either burned down or blew off. Anyway, a commoner, maybe we'll look at a few pictures here.
Want the light off there?
I think, can everybody see this okay? Okay. There's actually a big hook. You see a chain there hanging down this big set of hooks. And the chain goes up around a shaft. And there's this big wheel at the end. So they could wheel this over top of a rock. Or either in the center, right there, they could have a set of gears and a shaft, and they could chop corn, thrash grain, and run machinery with that. Or in many cases, they moved buildings. Instead of a gear system in the center, they might have like a capstan. They would pull up a rope or a cable, the belt, and back here's the saw. So they're cutting the winter's wood.
That's what they call them credit belts.
Yeah.
Well, all kinds of things.
And any of the grains, you know, with a side or a cradle side, and then taking some of the grain, twisting it up into like a string, wrapping it around to make a sheath, and then stooking it, and I think many of us here can remember the days of stooking grain, but the harvester, the reaper, the binder.
Binder, yeah.
They have a machine that would actually tie a knot. Like people would, when this was first introduced back in the 1800s across parts of the United States and Canada, the idea of a machine that could actually tie a knot, people would walk for miles and miles just to see this amazing device because it was so phenomenal. And of course it was such a major impact on the farming, not only locally but across the prairie. I wouldn't know, but thrashing at the Willow's farm. What else we got here? This is the last thrashing that I was aware of in the local area, and this was John White. This is the milk list for the Lombardy factory, May the 8th, 1916, so this would have been during World War I, to May the 13th, same year, 1 week. They didn't make on Sunday. It's interesting looking here. They start from Monday through to Saturday, and then the total pounds each farmer produced. Rather amazingly, there are over 50 patrons providing milk for the factory. The amounts are interesting too, because one here, Richard Coble. Coble, of course, is still a name that's common in the Lombardy area. On Monday, May the 8th, he brought in 82 pounds of milk. 85 the next day, 90 the next day, 81, 86, 95, for a total of 519 pounds for the week. Other farmers, for instance, Robert Hughes, 445 pounds. What's interesting in comparison, of course, one farmer might produce as much milk now as this entire list might produce then. Joyce, maybe you can comment on that, because on Monday, since they didn't make it on Sunday, Monday was a big day, 14,000 pounds, that's 7 tons of milk. And so that's probably, they would have made 2 bats, 10,000 pounds per bat. On Tuesday it was 6,700, so about half, 9,195. The total for the entire week, for the 6 days, 56,047 pounds, so about 23 tons of milk. And it's interesting how they got paid. Of course, the milk check, many families literally live from milk check to milk check, and this check determined, just what you did for the next month, especially towards the end of the year. Depended whether Santa Claus's arrival depended very much on the milk check. This one is written through the Union Bank of Canada, and the old bank building in Portland was part of the Union Bank of Canada. And it was for $190.55 to Byron Blanchard. And those of us familiar with the Smith Falls area know Blanchard Road.
What year is that?
What year? This is September the 11th, 1917. Another interesting thing is there was a stamp on it here. And every transaction that went through the bank, the government collected a few pennies of it as a tax. So every time you wrote a check, a little bit, in this case 2 pennies, went to the Canadian government as a way of collecting taxes. It's interesting now that, with the problems in Europe with the banks and so on, one idea that's being floated is that every transaction that anybody does in North America, Europe, so on, every transaction should have a penny or so goes into an international bank fund to make sure that they're trying to make sure that this doesn't happen again. So anyway, the wagons came in underneath the roof, maybe to avoid water getting into the can when you're taking the tops off the cans. There was a big tank on a set of scales on the weighing-in stand, and there's a story about George Mattice again, a legendary character. He only went to school one day in his life. There was claimed anyway, and the teacher was away that day, so he never bothered going back. But he was probably one of the most prosperous and knowledgeable farmers of that time. But anyway, anytime George was lifting these 40-gallon cans out of the tank, he put both hands on the crank of the crane to lift up. And his 2 sons, Goodson and Garfield, as long as you remember Garfield, he was not a midget by any means, but they'd get their hands, both hands on. But when their mother, Ivy, came out, she might be holding a grandchild in one arm, she put one hand on this crank, just like that. Can just came right up. But the weighing-in stand was not only a business place in terms of bringing the milk, it was the place where the cheesemaker had to test the milk. You take it testing it to see if it's cleanliness, whether there's any sediment in the bottom of the cans. It also tested the smell. The cheesemaker had to have a very accurate sense of smell, because if the cows had been grazing on some nice clover, the milk would have a nice, sweet smell. But if one cow got into a mess of leaks, not only was the can lost, but if that can went into the whole vat of milk, then it had cheese that smelled like leaks. So anyway, it was very, very important to test the quality of the milk at that stage before it all got mixed.
Where would that be located now?
Just down from Wayne's Garage, where the parking lot is.
Out in the hollow there.
Yeah, that one still stands, at least in the shape, certainly not in its activity. There's this one on Garrett's Road, just up towards Clear Lake. It's called the Ontario Factory. It's on the town line. But again, it shows the typical architecture of the weighing-in stand. Lyndon Cowan was the cheesemaker here for many years. And And in larger factories like the Kraft factory or Cowan Gate, they could take the whey and take out some of the byproducts. One thing that they could in factories like this take out was the extra butter fat that was in the whey, and of course that's the origin of whey butter. But there's also a considerable amount of sugar and other byproducts, and so those little Kraft caramels, square ones that you used to get, and that was the sugar, some sugar content from the whey.
And what about whey powder that has been purchased today?
Yeah.
Isn't that directly dried whey?
Exactly.
Because it's high in protein?
Exactly. Yes. Some of the casein. This was the disadvantage of the little factories, is that they very often, like in meat processing and so on, the real profit comes from what you can do with what is otherwise waste. And the little factories just couldn't compete in terms of making Kraft caramels and whey, covered whey, and things like that, but the big factories could. This one burned down, so this was during the fire. Like happened to many cheese factories, of course, a combination of butter fat and boilers and fires and explosions. This is in Portland Cheese Factory. Before they had any electrification and mechanization, all of the agitation of the vat, that is just beneath the picture here, had to be done by hand power, by rakes. And so they mix in the starter and rennet, and then it had to be constantly agitated. A number of interesting features, like the hoops, metal hoops, so they could put 90 pounds of curd into that.
You point at the computer,
Yeah.
it doesn't show up.
It doesn't show
Tell
up.
us what you're pointing at.
Okay, great. Let's see, I can, if I get my little arrow to move around
This is
here.
a
Holy smokes. There. One of the stainless steel hoops, into which they put the curd after it had been milled, plus a fair bit of salt. And so they put about 100 pounds of curd into that, tip it on its side along with maybe half a dozen or a dozen other hoops, and squeeze them under enormous pressure. And that was to squeeze out as much of the whey as they possibly could. And the result was the next morning when they took the cheeses out of the hoops, they had 90-pound cheese, which after aging for at least maybe a month or so, could be put into a cheese box, like this one right here, that might have been produced in Haskell's mill. Very important
It's gotta
site
be
now.
right near the creek. That just as it goes around the corner there, is it?
Fairly close, yeah.
Township office?
The township offices are built on the site where the Champion Cheese Factory was. It was built
I
out.
was thinking, well,
I figured that was school.
And they, before they had refrigeration back in the early 1900s, refrigeration came in. First of all, you had to have electrification and refrigeration, so that came in the 1930s, 1940s. But up to that time, they had to bring in enormous amounts of ice, in this case from Upper Beverly Lake, on bobsleds. Again, 2 horsepower. And they'd store the ice in ice shed at the back of the cheese factory. And so that way they could try to keep the cheese at a fairly constant cool temperature through the summertime. Never as constant as those good old Chedder caves back in England, or eventually with refrigeration. So there are folks here that can tell us lots about this one. This is the delivery wagon for the cheese boxes from Haskell Mill in Phillipsville. There's another cheese box factory in Westport, as it calls it. There are a couple of them around the area.
There's one at Bell Rock.
Belmont, yeah. The cheese boxes, there are literally thousands and thousands of cheeses produced in the local area each summer. And they were stored, eventually when they went from the curing room, in many cases down to Brockville for further storage or for marketing, or to Kingston, they were shipped in cheese boxes. And anybody got one of these that's maybe upholstered in your house, or it's holding yarn up in the attic, or or maybe a whole bunch of, gazillion nails out in the shop or something like that. But these were the standard cheese boxes for the 90-pound cheeses. And the curved sides were veneered out of Brucetown.
Usually elm,
Usually elm, right?
some soft maple.
And so they could veneer that into a thin sheet that could be bent into the round part of the box. And then the top and the bottom were made of basswoods. And because it was light and also at that time quite cheap. And so they could make the boxes. And I think one time you're making what, up to, you had 20 people working with you at one point. So it was a very prominent industry in the local area, making the thousands and thousands of boxes for the cheeses that went to Britain, to the United States. And I remember every year, of course, back on the farm, we'd buy one cheese from the New Wine Cheese Factory, and it would come in a box of this. So anyway, the ways of moving them around.
You spoke of exporting, Doug. Do you know how many a week went?
Cheese is also going out from, we'll have a picture of this. Yeah, there's the B&W out of the Delta station. And as Anna mentioned, the train would have a special car once or twice a week to pick up the cheeses. They also had a special car too, I think it was on Thursdays or so, for pick up livestock here in more recent times, because as farmers no longer used it for feeding pigs and other livestock, what did they do with the hay? And at Plum Hollow, not too many years ago, they basically just dumped it down into the creek. And the folks in the environmental offices got very upset about that. Plum Hollow office, or Plum Hollow Cheese Factory got closed down. Great way of getting rid of woodchucks in your field. You try to wait turn on the tap. And yeah, pet dog was excellent for killing woodchucks at the time. So the dog would ride along in the seat of the weigh truck, and down would open up the tap, drown the woodchucks would come carrying out the hole, totally doused in whey. And then the dog had his fun of the day, got his exercise, finishing off the woodchuck. But anyway, in the wintertime, the problem was what to do with the whey when the ground is frozen. And there were problems that arose over that. And so eventually, it was going to be a matter of building an enormous whey tank to store the whey over the winter time here at Corker, and the owner just decided that really wasn't economically feasible. Sadly, unfortunately, it was the last of the 40-some factories that existed around here. Anyway, after an hour and a half of settling, folding, and great slabs of cheddar on the bottom of the vat, much of the remaining whey was squeezed out and ended up with a yellow purple cheese material.